You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life, and welcome to episode 300. I was thinking about getting to episode 300 and thinking about how much work I've put into this podcast, because it takes me about a day to do a podcast on average. That's a conservative estimate. Some of them take a lot longer than that. Like the Thinking Rationally series, I spent a week on each of those episodes. But on average, it takes me about a day to do some notes, do the recording, do the editing, upload, and all of that. So I've done 300 days work on this podcast, and there are less than 300 working days in a year, which means I've done over a year of full-time work on The Voluntary Life at this point. So thank you so much for sticking with me this far, and I hope you've enjoyed the episodes up until episode 300. I was thinking about what should I do for episode 300, and I'm not going to do a retrospective because I have talked quite a lot recently about how the voluntary life has impacted people, and I've spoken about that when describing why I've started a Patreon page. So I didn't want to do an episode 300 like that. So I was thinking about what subject to do this on, and I thought I would look at what the most popular show has been so far. And interestingly enough, the most popular show is actually episode 272, Why I Choose Peaceful Parenting. That's quite a recent episode, but it's already the most downloaded show that I've got. It's not the most downloaded of anything that I've done. I do have the video 4 Ways to Quit the Rat Race on YouTube, and that's got 250,000 views, so that's way more popular. But in terms of podcast episodes, my most popular show is now Why I Choose Peaceful Parenting. So in this episode, I thought I'd do some more on the topic of peaceful parenting, since that seems to be one that has got a lot of interest, and I did not expect that. So it's interesting to me to see how much interest there is in peaceful parenting on the podcast. So that's going to be the topic covered in this week's show. But before we get to that, I just want to say a big thank you to all the people who've signed up to become patrons of the show in the last week on my Patreon page. They are Kyle M, Yanni, Jeff T, Boris P, Pablo D, and Jamie C. Thanks so much, guys. And I just want to share a quick bit of news with you. Thanks to the Patreon campaign, you are now listening to the new podcast feed, which should mean that this podcast feed will have better show notes that you'll be able to click on all different podcatchers, and you should now be able to get all of the previous episodes in your podcast feed. We had a technical issue before with the old platform that limited the number of episodes, but if you check now, you should be able to get access to all the previous episodes. That's all thanks to my patrons. And so I've been also very happy over the last week to provide my patrons with a number of bonuses. We had our first live stream, and I've just released the first podcast episode of a really good conversation that we had on the live stream. One of my patrons was wondering whether or not to go into business with a particular person, and we had a really good chat about that. And that recording is now available as a bonus episode. I've also provided my patrons with a full breakdown of all of my project management tools and lots of other good things that you can find on Patreon. So if you want to get all those bonuses, don't forget to sign up and become a patron of The Voluntary Life. You can find a link on the website, thevoluntarylife.com, or go directly to patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So on to this week's episode, and we're going to talk about peaceful parenting. As I said, my most popular episode is on peaceful parenting, but this is also a topic that definitely provokes a lot of responses, both positive and negative. And I've noticed something about the responses that people have to ideas of peaceful parenting. I've noticed that the kind of objections that I get to peaceful parenting demonstrate that people think about parenting in radically different ways to me. I mean, we're almost on different planets in the way that we're thinking about this. And I think underlying that, there are fundamentally different principles that people have that they are using to make decisions about parenting. Because whenever I hear an objection to ideas of peaceful parenting, I can respond to the objection itself, the substance of the objection, but I also notice that the objection to me sounds kind of bonkers and really quite bizarre. I'll give you an example. I got into a discussion with somebody about circumcision. And this person made the argument that although female circumcision is a terrible, terrible thing, male circumcision, circumcising boys, is totally harmless and on the same level as clipping a child's toenails. Now, when it comes to this kind of argument, I can certainly respond to the substance of the argument. Of course, one of the principles of peaceful parenting, as I understand it, is that parents don't have the right to circumcise a child. It's an act of aggression. It's not necessary surgery. Children own their bodies. And arguments like parents who say that this would result in a more aesthetically pleasing look, these kind of arguments are totally irrelevant to the ethics of submitting your children to unnecessary surgery. So I can make all those arguments about the substance of someone's objections to peaceful parenting. But the thing I want to share with you is that I find it almost surreal having a conversation where I make these kinds of arguments, because I sort of think, if you really think that circumcision is the same as clipping a child's toenails, I don't think there's anything that I could possibly say that would change your mind or influence you on this topic, because the objection, even on the face of it, sounds so bonkers to me that we're sort of on different planets in the way that we think about this. And this is something I notice a lot when it comes to peaceful parenting. So there are certainly a lot of people out there who, it doesn't matter what I say on peaceful parenting, they're never going to listen to it, and they're never going to accept the arguments, and we're almost going to be speaking past each other, because when you start from that kind of level of discussion, if someone genuinely believes that circumcision is the same as clipping toenails, I don't really think there's anything that I can say to change their mind, because they hold such absurd ideas that I don't think they're going to be amenable to reasoned argument. Now, of course, I can speculate as to why somebody would not be open to reasoned argument when it comes to peaceful parenting. And in the case of that discussion that I mentioned, the guy who I was talking to was, of course, himself circumcised. And that means that this topic is a pretty explosive one, because if he were to acknowledge that circumcision is unethical, then that would be a direct criticism of his own parents and potentially of parenting choices that he might want to make if it's part of his religion or culture. So there's lots of possible reasons why someone might not be open to hearing these kinds of arguments. And I'm not trying to convince that guy in this podcast, because, as I said, I don't think anything I could say will get through to him. What I want to do in this podcast is rather to outline a way of thinking about parenting that might help you if you can't yet see why I think that idea is so bonkers. It might help you to get into this way of thinking about parenting. It might be a way to think like a peaceful parent. So I'm talking to you if you are not committed ideologically to any particular type of parenting, but you don't yet necessarily understand why I think peaceful parenting is such an obvious choice in terms of ethics. Parenting is not random. Everyone has some principles that they work with as a parent. Most people don't make these principles explicit. They just follow them implicitly. And I did an episode on peaceful parenting principles, explaining very explicitly what the philosophical principles are that underlie peaceful parenting. That was episode 278, and it was called 3 Principles of Philosophy Applied to Parenting. So I do recommend checking that out if you're interested to understand the principles that underlie peaceful parenting. Very briefly, the principles are that parents owe their kids positive obligations, not the other way around, because we're all responsible for our actions. As a parent, if you create a child, you owe that child positive obligations to bring that child to adulthood safely. Whereas your children did not choose to be born, they didn't choose you, they don't have the same positive obligations that you have. Second principle is that children own themselves. Just because they are vulnerable, it doesn't mean that they're not self-owners like all human beings. And the fact that they need to be cared for doesn't remove their rights of self-ownership. And the third principle is that it's wrong to initiate aggression against children. As a universal rule, self-defense is acceptable, but initiating aggression is wrong. And things such as spanking or hitting children or these kinds of activities are acts of aggression. They're not self-defense. And so doing these things is not a moral or ethical way to behave towards children. I mean, in short, really, peaceful parenting is essentially seeing children as human beings, deserving of the same respect as adults. So those are the principles of peaceful parenting. Now, what are the principles that people who don't advocate peaceful parenting are working on? What are their principles? Because as I said, people are not parenting randomly. They do have some principles. They just haven't been explicit with themselves about what those principles are. But if we tried to be explicit about them, what would they be for a non-peaceful parent? Well, I would suggest that you can simply flip the three principles that I just explained to do with peaceful parenting to their opposites, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what some people think parenting is all about and why they find it really difficult to get their heads around the idea of peaceful parenting. So, for example, if we flipped those three principles of peaceful parenting, then the non-peaceful parent would believe the following. They would believe, number one, that children owe their parents positive obligations, not the other way around. So in other words, this would be the idea that because you have given birth to a child, because you've given that child life, that child is in your debt. They owe you obedience and gratitude and following your will and so forth. Essentially because they live because you determined that they could live. It's like that phrase from the olden times when people would say, I serve at the pleasure of the king. That would be what sort of servants in a royal court would say, I serve at the pleasure of His Majesty. This idea would be a bit like, your children live because of the wishes of the parents, and therefore their whole existence is kind of in debt to their parents. That's the opposite to the principle of peaceful parenting that I talked about. When you look at this from a perspective of peaceful parenting, the fact that you chose to have a child means that you put that child in a position of danger by bringing it into the world. You're responsible for your actions, and in bringing someone into the world, you have put that person, that child, in a position of danger in the same way as if you had pushed someone into a lake. You have a positive obligation to get that person out of the lake. And as a parent, if you bring a helpless infant into the world, you have a positive obligation to nurture that infant until it reaches the safety of adulthood and is capable of looking after itself. Whereas the opposite, if you like, the unpeaceful parent would say that the child owes the parent whatever the parent wants because the child only lives thanks to the parent. The second principle that I think a lot of people implicitly believe about parenting is that children belong to their parents. They are the property of their parents. And this could be either a bit like a pet, or a bit like a slave, or a bit like a toy. But many people implicitly act as if they own their children. As I said before, the idea behind peaceful parenting is the principle that we are all self-owners, that children own themselves. Even if they require help, even if they're helpless, they still own themselves. So you can't do whatever you like to them, and you can't treat them like a slave or a pet or a toy. You have to treat them with the respect that you would treat an adult who was in a state of helplessness. Like a pedestrian that you run over in the street. That person might need your help, but it doesn't mean that they've stopped owning themselves. And that's the philosophy behind peaceful parenting. Whereas I think a lot of people implicitly believe that they own their children, and therefore they can do whatever they damn well please as a parent. The third implicit principle that I think a lot of parents assume and follow without really being conscious of it is the idea that you can act out aggression on your children as long as you mean well or you have an excuse. So in other words, a lot of people equate spanking with discipline. They call it disciplining a child, when really what they mean is hitting a child. But the principle that they're working on is it's not aggression if I don't think it is as a parent. If I have a good intention behind it, or even if I have some kind of excuse for what I'm doing, then it doesn't really count as aggression. That would be the opposite to the peaceful parenting principle, which is that it's wrong to initiate aggression against children. And in terms of peaceful parenting, it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it hitting, or you can change the word to spanking, or you can make up an entirely new word, or you can use euphemisms like discipline, but that doesn't change the basic fact that it's wrong to initiate aggression against children. So in peaceful parenting, that's a very clear principle. For the non-peaceful parent, I think the way that they think about that is that it's not hitting if we use a different word or if we have a good excuse. So if I say, I didn't hit the child, I spanked the child, and I did it because I was disciplining the child, then that makes it okay to act out aggressively against the child. So there's a comparison of the principles of peaceful parenting with the implicit principles behind a lot of other parenting. And I think people who find it really difficult to understand peaceful parenting, they have their own principles that they're working on. Either they have adopted them from their parents or from the culture at large, but their opinions about parenting aren't random. They are based on principles. It's just that these principles are usually not nearly as explicit as I have been about the peaceful parenting principles. And that's why I think a lot of people find it hard to hear me talk about peaceful parenting principles, because it forces them to question, well, what are their own principles? A useful way of thinking about this is to think about what analogy best fits the peaceful parenting approach and the non-peaceful parenting approach. I would say that this non-peaceful parenting approach, the idea that children owe their parents, that children belong to their parents, and that it's not aggression if you've got a good excuse for it, that idea, the sort of analogy that best fits parenting is a bit like if you imagine yourself as an engineer building an android. You know, this android is your project, it belongs to you, and you have a goal in mind. You want to build this android. And so you think about, what kind of android would I like to build? I would like to create it so that it could do various things. That would be cool if it could run really fast, or if it was really good at maths or something like that. I want it to speak in a certain way and have certain behaviors. And I'm going to program it to do those things because it's my android. And I have a vision for what my android should be like. In a similar way, I think a lot of people have a vision when they have children that I want this child to grow up to be a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher or something like that, because I think those things would be good. And I want this child to have certain opinions, and I want those opinions to mirror what I think are good. So that's kind of the way that some people think about children, and in doing so, they are treating the child like a pet or toy or project of the parent. The analogy that I want to share with you that I think is much closer to peaceful parenting is one that I've shared before, which is to imagine yourself as being the host of a visitor from another planet, a very distinguished alien guest who has arrived on this planet, who doesn't understand our ways and doesn't know how we do things here, but is keen to learn and needs to be looked after with a lot of dignity and a lot of care. That's the peaceful parenting approach. Another analogy that works for me sometimes is to think of this in terms of how would you behave if you were setting up a really professional private hospital? How would you behave towards your patients? And you can use that analogy to think about how reasonable some of these objections to peaceful parenting are. For example, to come back to the objection about circumcision, how reasonable would it be for me to say that I think it would be a good idea when our patients in our high-end private hospital, when they're under anesthetic or in a coma, I think we should just go ahead and circumcise them because it's the same as cutting their toenails and it looks more aesthetically pleasing. I think we should just circumcise them while they're in a coma or while they're under anesthetic. After all, they won't remember it, and it's just like clipping their toenails. Can you see how bonkers that argument sounds when you put it in that context? If you imagine yourself as the chief doctor or administrator in a high-end private hospital, and you can imagine having a board meeting where you're discussing, should we circumcise our patients without their consent. That's how bonkers the objections to peaceful parenting sound to me, because I'm looking at this from a very different set of principles to the implicit principles that I think a lot of people use when they are thinking about children and parenting. And the broader point from all of this is that just like with parenting, with every aspect of life, you always have some philosophical principles that you are working with. You just might not be explicit about it with yourself, but there are always principles underlying what you're doing. Now, the question is, do you have integrity to those principles, or do you have a bunch of contradictory principles that conflict with each other? And if you're not conscious of it, it's very hard to work out how to have integrity to a set of principles that you do actually agree with, rather than be buffeted around by a whole series of conflicting ideas without having real integrity to any of them. So I hope talking about how to think about peaceful parenting is helpful, not just in terms of the discussion about parenting, but also in terms about how to think about your principles in life in general. Hope you find that interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.